Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome. This is my reading Carl Schmitt's Political Theology, which is kind of a break between before I start my. I mean, I said I was in a break and I was going to be in a break, but I thought I have a couple days before I'm traveling, and I'm gonna just get this done. It's going to be a short little review of these four videos, maybe five videos if I want to do it. We'll look at Carl Schmitt's political theology. So today we're looking at the last chapter of his book on political theology, chapter 4, which looks at these what do you call these counter-revolutionary philosophies of the state. Schmitt in the 1922 book was kind of enamored by this what we call this Catholic right state, this counter-revolutionary, anti modernist, anti these this things, and therefore wanted to bring a light to them. De Maistre, Bonald, and Donoso Cortes, these late, mid 19th century, and a lot of reactionary writers. Like I know people who have become kind of reactionary. The series that the publishing house that published Parvini's Populist Delusion, the Imperial Press, does reprints de Maistre's works. De Maistre is really much of the thing. Was kind of a attempt a reactionary against the French Revolution and everything like that. Now I've always been kind of like lukewarm. I am not personally Catholic. I'm a Protestant, a Calvinist. Okay, I was raised Puritan American. Okay, oh American. I was born in America. New England, I'm a Rhode Islander, right? So therefore, we have therefore Roger Williams, which kind of, is though a Puritan, he was also kind of didn't like directions of Puritanism, brought Baptist tradition in America. And though my mother's side was Greek Orthodox, I was exposed to both of these religiosities, but neither of them neither Greek Orthodoxy nor a Baptist Calvinistic theology that I grew up with are welcome, very friendly towards Catholicism. Even though I went to Catholic university, Catholic colleges, and then for most of my degree, except my doctorate degree, which then I finally go to a secular school, secular state university for my doctorate. Um, Ironically, going to Catholic universities didn't make me Catholic. It just rewoke and it actually opened my eyes to Protestant theology. So I've never been kind of a fan of this kind of Catholic theology that uh, 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 that emphasizes throne and altar, right? That Schmitt liked, and I can see, even though I've appreciated Schmitt and Schmitt's thinking as a kind of very useful correlative to the problems that modern jurisprudence, positivist jurisprudence, brings forward, and that it does this. But at the same time, Schmitt goes a little too far in my thing. Now, of course, I think this is my difference with Schmitt, this is why I would stand with Strauss against Schmitt ultimately, and that idea that I think Schmitt doesn't realize that his critique doesn't critique far enough. Um, so let's look at what he does here. This is kind of like do our little thing here. See if I can screw this a little bigger and a little playing around with this a little bit. So let's go right to the text. Right, let's go right to the text. This is on the counter-revolutionary philosophy of the state, with De Maistre, Bonald, and German romantics possessed an odd trait: everlasting conversation. Novaris Adam Müller feels at home with it. To them, it constitutes the true realization of their spirits. The Catholic political philosophers such as de Maistre, Bonald, and Doncones, who are called romantics in Germany because they were conservative or reactionary and idealized the conditions of the Middle Ages, would have considered everlasting conversation a product of grotesque cosmic fantasy. For what characterized their counter-revolutionary political philosophy was the recognition that their times needed a decision. In other words, this is the thing: the Germanic idea of Novatus and Adam Müller for in the Romantics, this Germanic conception is endless conversation. In many ways, it's a liberal. There's a liberal inclination. The argument is right, whereas de Maistre, Bonald, and Cortes all wanted what? A decision to resolve the problem, and an energy that rose to an extreme between the two revolutions, 1789 and 1487, right? 1847, sorry, 1847, 48, 1848. These are the two French revolutions, right? The first, the original French Revolution that spread that, and then there's the second one, right? They thrust the notion of the decision to the center of their thinking. Whatever Catholic philosophy of the 19th century was engaged, it expressed the idea in one form or another that there now exists a great alternative that no longer allowed of synthesis. No medium exists, said Cardinal Newman, between Catholicity and atheism. Everyone formulated a big either or, the rigor of which sounded more like a dictatorship than an everlasting conversation. The Restoration fought against the spirit of the French Revolution, with ideas such as tradition and custom, with the belief that history progresses slowly. Ideas of that sort could have led to a complete negation of the naturalistic reason and to an absolute moralistic passivity that would have considered becoming active altogether evil. Traditionalism has been seen has tradition has been theologically refuted by J. Lupus and P. Cachas, by the latter identically with references to sentimental Le Monde, that was supposed to be the source of such errors. In other words, the argument these people, this traditional theologically was. In the final analysis, extreme traditionalism actually meant an irrational rejection of every intellectual consensus decision, even even though Bonald, the founder of traditionalism, was far removed from the idea of an everlasting evolution spurred in and of itself. In other words, it's not an everlasting evolution. It's a thing of tradition. But his intellect had an altogether different structure than that of Miss. Okay, I know I can say Maistre, and that of Donoso Cortes. Bond often showed himself to be surprisingly German, but his belief in tradition never turned into something like Schilling's philosophy of nature. Adam Muller's mixture of opposites, Hegel's belief in history. In other words, it didn't. In other words, Bouland's thing did not turn into Schilling's philosophy of nature, or Adam Muller's mixtures of opposites, or Hegel's belief in history. For Bonald, tradition offered the sole positively of gaining the context that man was capable of accepting metaphysically, because the intellect of the individual was considered too weak and wretched to be able to recognize the truth by itself. There was the weak individual, the weak soul. The weak soul was too weak and wretched to be able to recognize the truth, and therefore, this mechanism of tradition was allowed a mechanism to accept the truth. What a contrast there is to each of these three Germans in their horrifying picture that depicts the course of humanity and history. These Germans of what he said that Schiller's nature, Miller's mixture of hypothesis, and Hegel's history, right? Uh, of humanity. A herd of blind men led by a blind man who gropes his way forward with a cane. The antithesis of distinction that Bonald was so fond of and earned him the name of a scholastic contains, in truth, moral disjunctions, and not polarities in the sense of Schilling's philosophy of nature, which reveals indifference points, or mere dialectical negations of historical process. I find, quote, I find myself constantly between two abysses. I walk between being and nothingness. Again, that's Schilling. Such moral disjunctions represents the contrast between good and evil, God and the devil. Between them and either or exists in the sense of a life in-depth struggle that does not recognize a synthesis in a higher third. In other words, there's no synthesis here. It's an either or. The master spoke with a particular fondness of sovereignty, which essentially meant decision. To him, the relevance of the state rested on the fact that it provided a decision. The relevance of the church on its rendering of the last decision that could not be appealed. Decision of God in that sense, it cannot be appealed. And infallibility was for him the essence of the decision that cannot be appealed. And the infallibility of the spiritual order was that of the same nature as the sovereign of the state order. The two words, infallibility and sovereignty, were perfectly synonymous for Donoso, right? This is to him, every sovereignty acted as if it were infallible. Every government was absolute. A sentence that an anarchist could pronounce verbatim, even if his intention was an entirely different one. In this sentence, lies the clearest antithesis in the entire history of political ideas. All the anarchist theories, from Belf to Bakun, Bakunin to Kropotkin, and Otto Gross, revolves around one axiom: the people are good, but the magistrate is corrupter. The master asserted the exact opposite, namely, that the authority as such is good once it exists. Any government is good once it's established. The reason being that a decision is inherent in the mere existence of a governmental authority, and the decision as such is in turn valuable precisely because, as far as the most essential issues are concerned, making a decision is far more important than how the decision is made. Right? Quote unquote. End quote. Here, this quotation ends the quote. Again, the text errors. I'm sorry about that. It is definitely not in our interest that a question be decided in one way or another, but that it be decided without delay and without appeal. Again, this I can see that as also. Sorry, that's not. I was. That's where the quote ends. This is the new quote. Okay, sorry, I see that. Again, this is why I hate this edition. To be honest with you guys, I hate this edition of the EPUB because there's a lot of typos. You can't always know whether there's a typo or not until you look at it again and again. So again, this is like, in other words, he says here, and he says that it's far more decision is made. It's not that how the decision is made. Making this decision is more important than how the decision is made. A decision needs to be made is an important issue, and it's not important how it's made in that sense. It is definitely not in our interest that a question be decided in one way or another, but that it be decided without delay and without appeal. This is even more interesting. A decision. Doesn't matter whether what answer it's one way or the other. Right? In practice, not to be subject to error and not to be accused of error were for him the same. It was not to be subject to error, not to be accused of error. The same. The important point was that no higher authority could review the decision. In other words, the decision was made by authority that had no appeal. There was no appeal to this, and that the state was thus like God. And that God was to this, and therefore the state and God are this entities in themselves. Just as revolutionary radicalism was far more profound and consequential in the proletarian revolutions of 1848 than in the 1789 revolution of the Third Estate. The intensity of the decision was also heightened in the political philosophy of the Counterrevolution. Only by recognizing that trends can be that trend can we understand the development from Maistre to Donoso Cortes, from legitimacy to dictatorship. That radical highlighting manifested itself in the increasing significance of the axiomatic thesis on the nature of man. Every political idea, in one way or another, takes a position on the nature of man and presupposes that he is either by nature good or by nature evil. Right? Different axiom. Every political system, every political idea, takes a position on the nature of man. Either he's good or he's evil. This issue can only be clouded by pedagogic or economic explanations, but not evaded. In other words, pedagogical or economic explanations can cloud or you know, but it cannot evade these questions. For the rationalism of the Enlightenment, man was by nature ignorant and rough, but educable. It was thus a pedagogical ground that the idea of the legal despotism was justified. Uneducated humanity is educated by a legislature who, according to Rousseau's social contract, was able to change the nature of man. Or unruly nature could be conquered by Fichte's tyrant, and the state became, as Fichte said, with naive brutality, an educational factory. Marxist socialism considered the question of the nature of man incidental and superfluous because it believed that it changes in economic and social conditions changes man. To the committed atheistic anarchist, man is decisively good, and all evil is a result of theological thought and its derivatives, including all ideas concerning authority, state, and government. In the social contract, those connect construct with whose constructions in terms of the theory of state, Maistre and Bonald were primarily concerned, were what man was by no means conceived to be by nature good, as Ernest Cellier has so splendidly demonstrated. Only Rousseau's later novel unfolded the celebrated Rousseauian thesis of the good man. Don Cortes, in contrast, opposed Proudhon, whose anti-theological anarchism would have to be derived consistently from the axiom of the good man, whose starting point for the Catholic Spaniard was a dogma of the original sin. In other words, Cortes's thing was original sin. Well, that's the good man. But Don Cortes radicalized this polemicy into a doctrine of the absolute sinfulness and depravity of human nature. So Cortes even radicalized even that. Not that individuals. The dogma of original sin promulgated in the Council of Trent is not radical in any simple way. In contrast to the Lutheran understanding, the dogma asserts not absolute worthlessness, but only distorts optically or injury and leaves open the possibility of natural good. Abel Guan, who criticized Don Cortes from the standpoint of the dogma, was therefore right when he voiced misgivings about his extravagance of the natural evil and unworthiness of man. Yet it was certainly not right to have overlooked the fact that for Don Cortes, this was a religious and political decision of Colossus actuality, and not just an elaboration of dogma. When he spoke of the natural evil of man, he polemicized against an atheist anarchism and its axiom of the good man. He meant, now this is where I have to stop for a second and check my. Okay, this is Greek, and the actual text is two Greek words, and the Greek here is this is not is this word is doimaticus, which is dogmatism, right? The dogmatic, and this is a a gomnikos, gomokos, which I think he means the question of this two different things, right? Conceptually here, this is not this is the dogma. This is not about the question of dogma, but about. Okay, this is a big word. This is he meant agnostikos, not dogmaticos. In other words, he meant the agnostic, the one who does not believe. Even though it appears that he agreed here with Lutheran dogma, his position was different from the Lutheran, which mandated obedience to every authority. He thus retained the self-confident grandeur of the spiritual descendants of the Grand Inquisitor. In other words, the question of the Grand. In fact, this is the famous line of Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, right? In the Brothers K, Karamazov. where Christ is subjected to the Inquisitor's critique of Christ is that God, you made a mistake. You didn't say, criticize Christ because you're not setting up a kingdom, right? That seems to be the whole point. What Don Cartos, uh, okay, what Donoso Cortes had to say about the natural depravity and vileness of man was indeed more horrible than anything that ever had been alleged by an absolute philosophy of state and justifying authoritarian rule. De Maistre was capable of being shocked by the wickedness of man. His utterance on the nature of man gained force from his lack of illusions about morality and from solidarity of psychological experiences. Bonald was no less clear about the fundamental evil instinct of man and recognized the indestructible will to power, as do modern psychologists. But his conceptions of human nature pales in comparison to the outburst of Don Cortes, whose contempt for man knew no limit. Man's blind reason, his weak will, and his ridiculous vitality of his uh, uh, Camel longings appeared to him to be so pitiful that all words in every human language do not suffice to express the complete lowness of this creature. Had God not become man, this reptile that my foot tramples would have been no less contemptuous than a human being. In the Spanish, it says, El repete esto peno el can mes pis, sires e miso o manoso dis disprescabil quel el home. Right? This is basically the translation of this. Right? Had God not become man, this reptile my feet trampled would have been no less contemptuous than a human being than man. The stupidity of the masses was just as apparent to him as the silly vanity of their leaders. His awareness of sin was universal. He was even more horrified than a Puritan. No Russian anarchist, in asserting that man is good, expressed a greater deal of elementary conviction than the Spanish Catholic who said, "Since God has not said it to him, whence he does he know that he is good?" This is again the Spanish line of it, right? The despair of this man, as can be gathered from his letter to his friend Count Raczynski, often bordered on insanity, according to his philosophy of history. The vicinity of evil is self evident and natural, and only a miracle of God can avert it. The pictures in which his impression of humanity were objectified were full of dread and horror. Humanity reels blindly through a labyrinth of what we call history, whose entrance, exits, and shapes nobody knows. Humanity is a boat aimlessly tossed about the sea and manned by a mutinous, vulgar, forcibly recruited crew that howls and dances until God's rage pushes the rebellious rabble into the sea so quietly that it can prevail once more. But the typical picture of a different one, the bloody, decisive battle that has flared up today between Catholicism and atheistic socialism. So there's tension of this, but the typical picture is a different one. The bloody battle has flared up between Catholicism and atheism. According to Don Cortes, it was characteristic of bourgeois liberalism not to decide in this battle, but instead to begin a discussion. His straightforward he straightforwardly declined the bourgeoisie as a discussing class, la classe discutidora. It it has thus been sentenced. Thus, definition contains the class characteristics of wanting to evade the decision. Okay, so his idea, Cortes argues that the bourgeoisie wants discussion, wants to evade a discussion. A class that shifts all political activity into the plane of conversation in the presses and in parliament is no match for a social conflict. The insecurity and immaturity of the liberal bourgeoisie of the July monarchy can be recognized everywhere. Its liberal constitutionalism attempted to paralyze the king through parliament, but permitted him to remain on the throne. An an inconsistency committed by deism when it excluded God from the world but held on to his existence. Here, Donoso, uh, Donoso Cortes adopted from Bonald the immense fruitful parallel of metaphysics and the theory of the state. Period. Though the liberal bourgeoisie wanted a god, its god could not become active. It wanted a monarch, but it had to be powerless. It demanded freedom and equality, but limited voting rights to the property classes in order to ensure the influence of the educated and property on legislation, as if education and property entitled that class to repress the poor and uneducated. It abolished the aristocracy of blood and family, but permitted the imprudent rule of the moneyed aristocracy, the most ignorant and the most ordinary form of an aristocracy. It wanted neither the sovereignty of the king nor the people. What did it actually want? What did it actually want? This is the criticism of liberalism. Liberalism is this contradiction between the people and the king. Absolutely. The curious contradiction of this liberalism struck not only revolutionaries such as Donoso Cortes and F. de Stael, but also revolutionaries such as Marx and Engels. Moreover, we find a rare situation in which we can confront, in a concrete political context, for once, a bourgeois German scholar of Hegelian education with a Spanish Catholic. Without influencing one another, both diagnose the same inconsistency, but offer different evaluations. They are provided, thus, they provide a contrast of the highest typological clarity. In his Gunschil de Social Benoit in Frankish in Frankreich, Lorenz von Stein spoke in detail about the liberals. They wanted a monarch, in other words, a supreme personal authority with an independent will and independent action. Yet they made a king a mere executive organ with his very act dependent on the consent of cabinet, thus removing once again that personal element. They wanted a king. They wanted a king who would be above parties, who would thus also have to be above the people's assembly. And simultaneously, they insisted that a king could not do anything but execute the will of the people's assembly. They declared the person of the king to be inviolable, but they had him take an oath on the Constitution, so that a violation of the Constitution became possible but could not be pursued. No human ingenuity, said Stein, is insufficiently sharp to resolve this contradiction conceptual. This must be doubly particular to the party such as the liberal, which, after all, prides himself on its rationalism. F. J. Stahl, a Prussian conservative, who in his lecture über die, okay, I can't say Gegenwartigen Party of Staat and Church. In other words, this is something about this treated. In other words, this his thing about the parties of the state and church. Again, this is one of those German horrible words I hate. Okay, let's do this. Okay. Okay, yeah, I was right. It was the present condition of the present condition of the parties of the state and church treated many contradictions of the constitutional liberalism, offered a very simple explanation. The hatred of the monarchy and aristocracy drove the liberal bourgeoisie leftward. The fear of being disposed of his property, which was threatened by radical democracy and socialism, drove him towards the right, to a powerful monarchy whose military could protect him. Thus, he oscillated between his two enemies and wanted to fool both. Stein's explanation was entirely different. He replied by referring to life and precisely attributed to the many contradictions to the complexity of life. The irreconcilable merging of opposites into one another is precisely the true character of all living things. Therefore, this contradictions of these two forces. Everything that exists contains the opposite. Pulsating life consists in the continuous penetration of opposite forces. And in actuality, they are really opposites only when cut away from life. In other words, this point that these forces are both operating in their Stein argues, Schmitt explaining Stein that these forces are constantly these forces are operating within life, and that they're only seen as opposing in this sense is when you remove it from life. In other words, when the only opposite, these two forces are opposite of each other when cut away from life. He then compared the mutual presentation, uh, 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 penetra- penetration of opposites with what happens in organic nature and in personal life. And then he said of the state that it too has a personal life. It belongs to the essence of life and to generate slowly and constantly, the S, the S T A and T L constant S and T L Y for T and L that became D, right? In this stupid edition. From within, new opposites, new harmonies, and so on. Maistre and Donoso Cortes were incapable of such organic thinking. Maistre, in other words, so therefore, this is the Stahl understood it organically, right? His idea organically, whereas Maistre, this was not organic thinking. Maistre showed this by his total lack of understanding of Schilling's philosophy of life. Don Cortes was gripped by horror when he was confronted with Hegelianism in Berlin in 1849. Both were diplomats and politicians with such experience and practice and had constituted sufficiently sensible compromises. But a systemic and metaphysical compromise was to them inconceivable. To suspend the decision at a crucial point by denying that there was at all something to be decided upon must have appeared to them to be strange pantheistic confusion. Liberalism, with its contradictions and compromises, existed for Don Cortes only in that short interim period in which it was possible to answer the question, Christ or Barbarous. In other words, that liberalism is that moment they have a choice. You have a choice there. But once you make the choice is like that, right? With a proposal to adjourn or appoint a commission in other words, the possible to answer this question with a proposal to adjourn or appoint a commission of investigation. Such a position was not accidental, but was based on liberal metaphysics. The bourgeoisie is the class committed to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It did not arrive at those freedoms from any kind of arbitrary psychological and economic conditions, but from thinking in terms of trade or the like. In other words, conditions from. In other words, they did not. In other words, this is interesting. The bourgeoisie committed to freedom of speech and freedom of it did not arrive at those freedoms from any kind of arbitrary psychological and economic conditions, from thinking in terms of trade or the like. It has long been known that the idea of the liberal rights of man stem from the North American states. Through George Jelinek, recently demonstrated the North American origins of those freedoms. The thesis would hardly have surprised the Catholic philosopher of the state, nor, incidentally, would it have surprised Karl Marx, the author of the essay on the Jewish question. Further, economic postulates of free trade and commerce are, for the examination within the realm of history of ideas, only derivatives of a metaphysical core. In other words, this idea that the American idea, this Anglo-American conception, is the product of this Anglo-American or this North American idea of this produces a kind of liberal view of freedom of speech and freedom of trade. This is okay. In other words, Don Cortes and his radical intellectuality saw only the theology of the foe. He did not theologize in the least. There was no ambiguous metaphysical combinations or analogies, no Orphic oracle. The letters about actual political questions revealed a sober attitude, often frightening, and without any sort of illusion or any touches of the quixotic, right? In his systemic train of thought, there was an effort to be concise in the good Demotic tradition of theology. There was he's being concise. He's following his tradition. His intuition into things intellectual was therefore striking. His definition of the bourgeoisie as as a class, the discussion class, and his recognition that its religion resides in freedom of speech and the press are examples. I do not consider this to be the last word on continental liberalism in its entirety, but it is certainly the most striking. In a view of the system of a concordate, for example, whose typical meaning Wollsendorf, perhaps because of intellectual affinity, recognized superbly described, one must truly believe that the kind of political life consists in discussing, not only in the legislative body, but also among the entire population, if human society will transform itself um, into a monstrous club, and if truth will emerge automatically through voting. Don Cortes considered continuous discussion a method of circumventing responsibility and ascribing to freedom of speech and the press an excessive importance that, in the final analysis, permits the decision to be evaded. Just as liberalism discusses and negates every political detail, so it wants to dissolve metaphysical truth in a discussion. Hence, the essence of liberalism is negotiation, a cautious half measure, in hope that the definitive dispute, the decisive bloody battle, can be transformed into a parliamentary debate and a permanent decision to be suspended forever in an everlasting discussion. Oh, this is. And think about this. Isn't this the problem with the liberal in that sense? The liberal wants to make everything a discussion instead of having a decision. Now, this is, I can understand this. This is, because the decision is so horrifying and may require, hate to say it, the decision does involve using violence. Okay, violence means killing people. It means, this is what the problem of dealing with the left today. I mean, how do we deal with the left? We keep on discussing it and talking about it. We arguing with them. Arguing them is not going to point. You can't persuade people. In other words, people who are not going to be willing to be persuaded or don't accept your definitions, who don't understand what woman is, can't be reasoned with. You can't reason with people who are not using your definitions, right? Therefore, only violence is the answer in that weird way. Only this is the sad thing about this in that sense. And the problem with the liberal mind is that doesn't want to go there. We can't use violence because violence is bad. It's going to hurt people. No, no, we shouldn't do that. Sorry, no. Then you're postponing the reality, which then gives the violent people the right to dead violently. This is what's wrong with a lot of my conservative friends in America, particularly those that's why I call them libertarians. They're retards in that sense, but they don't realize you can't just keep on talking about individualism encourages collectivism. Doesn't work. Sorry. The collectivists aren't going to follow your debate. He's going to act by what? He believes he has the truth. He's not going to accept your understanding, and he's going to impose his will on you. Oh, but we have to argue with them. And no, you have to take a bat and beat the crap out of them. This is the problem. This is, and I can see why Cortes is getting to. There's a logic here. There's a visceral logic here. But there is also let's look at this from the point of view of the liberal in a sense. The liberal's also right. It is. There's something horrifying about this. This is what Burke said. This is the danger of the revolution. This is why Burke is, I think, better than Maistre. And I think that it's funny. Burke is this point where Burke understands that the origins of this is brutal, horrifying. The origins of a culture and civilization is this brutality and is this monstrosity. But then what we do is we kind of put facades over draperies and things like this over it to make it more acceptable for us. We want it to be more acceptable. But we want to forget about the brutality of the part before because it makes us more gentle. It makes things better over time. But the problem is once we go back, we want to revert to beginning origins and go to the origins, and you have to get back to the brutality. But the question is, do we gentle people have the stomach for the brutality? And the answer is probably not. Okay, and that may be the problem. Maybe that's why the civilized people may be destroyed ultimately in that sense. In this problem, And that's why this is why it's so horrifying that Cortes's position is kind of, and I think Schmitt says, is why it's the debate, this decisive willingness to stand up and make a decision against keep on discussing. And this is why the radical right, this is why someone like Cortes and the reactionary right and this radical tradition right share with the Marxists in some way. They want to make a decision, even though the reason for the decision is completely antithetical to each other. They're decisive. They're not gonna fall for this half measure of discussion that the liberal mind wants. So let's continue. Dictatorship is the opposite of discussion. It belongs to the decisionism of one like Donoso Cortes, to assume the extreme case, to anticipate the last judgment. That extremist cast of mind explains why he was contemptuous of the liberals, why he respected atheistic anarchistic socialism as his deadly foe, and endowed it with a diabolical structure. In Proudhon, he claimed to see a demon. Proudhon laughed about it and alluded to the Inquisition as if he were already on the funeral pyre. He called out to Don Cortes, ignited, right? The Satanism of that period was not an identical paradox, but a powerful intellectual principle. And its literary expression was the elevation of the throne of Satan, the adopted father of those who, in a fit of anger, cast out God, the Father, from the earthly paradise, and of Cain, the fratricide, while Abel, the bourgeois, was warming his belly at the patriarchal hearthside. The descendants of Cain ascend to heaven, and on earth throw down God. Boulade. This is that famous Boulade is the famous poem that that Boulade's infamous poem, "The Flowers of Evil." Right. This is that decadent period of late 19th century, early 20th century poetry. This decadency. But the position was untenable, primarily because it provided only an exchange of the roles of the part of God and the devil. Moreover, in comparison with the later anarchists, Proudhon was a moralist pedant bourgeoisie. In other words, he was Baudouin was a moralist pedant bourgeoisie who continued to ascribe to the authority of the father and the principle of the monogamous family. Bakunin was the first to give the struggle against theology its complete consistency of an absolute naturalism. He too wanted to disseminate Satan, and this he considered to be the sole true revolution, in contrast to Karl Marx, who scorned every form of religion. Bakunin's intellectual significance rests, nevertheless, on his conception of life, on which the basis of its natural tightness produces the correct forms of itself from itself. From him, therefore, there was nothing negative or evil except the theological doctrine of God and sin, which stamps man as the villain in order to provide a pretext for domination and the hunger for power. Right, this is Bakunin. All moral evaluations lead to theological, and to an authority that artificially imposes an alien or extrinsic ought on the natural and intrinsic truth and beauty of life. So therefore, there was this idea that God, a moral value, imposes an order of ought on life, intrinsic and beautiful human life, and therefore distorts it, right? The sources of such authority are greed and lust for power, and the result in general corruption of those who exercise power, as well as over those whom it is exercised. Where anarchists today see in the patriarchal family and in monogamy the actual state of sin, and when they preach the return of matriarchy, the supposedly paradisical original state, they are manifesting a strong awareness of the deepest connection that is reflected in Proudhon's laugh. Right, This is to make Perdue laughs at Don Cortes, say, "Oh, you think I'm the devil?" Oh, and laughs. Ignite the fire, right? Don Cortes always had in mind the final consequences of the dissolution of the family resting on the authority of the father, because he saw that the moral vanished with the theological, and the political idea with the moral. In other words, that as the authority of the father dies. In other words, the final consequence doesn't rest on the authority of the father. So once you go to the father, the family destroys. And he saw the moral world vanishes with the theological, and the political with the moral. And all moral and political decisions are thus paralyzed in a parasitical world, in a parasitical, paradise-like worldliness of imminent natural life and unproblematic concreteness. In other words, its decisions are just nullified. No political decision. It is just this parasitical worldliness of immin, immin, immediated natural, immediate natural life, and unproblematic concreteness. Today, nothing is more modern than the onslaught against the political. In other words, the political American financiers, industrial technicians, Marxist socialists, and in other words, the financiers, the economists, the industrial technicians, the Marxist socialists, and the anarchical syndicalist revolutionaries unite in demanding that the biased rule of politics over the unbiased economic management be done away with. There must no longer be political problems, only organizational, technical, and economical, sociological tasks. The kind of economical, technological thinking that prevails today is no longer capable of perceiving a political idea. The modern state seems to have actually become what Marx envisioned, a huge industrial plant. In other words, this is nothing but, in other words, the modern state seems to have become what Weber envisioned, that of a huge industrial plant, organization theory. The organization, that's why organization, administration. This is what administration replaces politics, right? That's the whole point. The political ideas are generally recognized only when groups can be identified that have uh, a possible economic interest in turning them to their advantage. Whereas on the one hand, the political vanishes into the economical or technical organization, and on the other hand, the political dissolves into the everlasting discussion of cultural and philosophical historical commonplaces, which by aesthetic characterization, identify and accept as epochs as classical, romantic, and baroque. So therefore, again, let's look at this paragraph. This is a weird. The one, whereas, okay, the political ideas identified with plausible economic interests to advantage. Right? This is how politics is reduced. The organization model with different groups having that, right? Whereas on the one hand, the politics vanishes into the economic or technical organization, right? The question of economic. On the other hand, the political dissolves into everlasting discussion of cultural and philosophical commonplaces, which aesthetic characterization identify and accept as epochs as classical, romantic, or baroque. The core political ideas, the enacting moral decisions, is evaded in both. In both these situations, the real issue about this, the core political ideas about exacting a moral decision, is evaded. The true significance of those counter-revolutionary philosophers of the state lies precisely in the consistency which they derive. They highlighted the moment of decision to such an extent that the notion of legitimacy, their starting point, was finally dissolved. As soon as Donoso Cortes realized that the period of the monarchy had come to an end because there were no longer kings, and no one would have the courage to be king in any way other than by the will of the people, he brought his decisionism to its logical conclusion. He demanded a political dictator. He in a cited remark of de Maistre, we can see a reduction of the state to the moment of decision, to a pure decision, not based on reason and discussion, and not justifying itself. That is, to an absolute decision created out of nothingness. To an absolute decision created out of nothingness. So this is this line. In other words, Cortes reduced it to dictatorship, and this is no longer kings, then dictators, right? And I think Cortez's Spanish thinking. This will, I think, this is where you get the kind of thinking what's his name, many of people on the right and like my mind is blanking on this. Julius Uleva. I can't. It's blanking. Uleva, Julius. Well, he's not Spanish. He's Italian. I always think he's Spanish for some reason. Evola, Julius Evola. Um, I think there is this kind of Cortesian, Evola's understanding of tradition and his fascistic understanding of this dictatorship is this, I think, is the direction of Cortes. And I think it's something Schmitt himself hits on, right? Um, Therefore, this idea that in other words, he demanded dictatorship. In the cited remarks of de Maistre, we also can see a reduction of the state to the moment of decision, to a pure decision not based on reason and discussion. In other words, it's not about discussion and reason, but rather, and not justifying itself, not a justification. In other words, the decision is out. It is an absolute decision created out of nothingness. But this decision is essentially dictatorship, not legitimacy. This decision creates a dictator, a willing agency that is not legitimacy. Remember, legitimacy kind of is consent, is a justification, right? So Don Cortes was convinced that the moment of the last battle had arrived. In the face of radical evil, the only solution is dictatorship. And the legitimist principle of succession becomes at such a moment an empty dogmatism. In other words, the question of legitimacy, of succession of this. In other words, in this last battle, the succession doesn't matter. It is simply that it's either us or them. Authority and anarchy could thus confront each other in absolute decisiveness, and clear and form a clear antithesis. De Maistre said that every government is necessary, absolute, and an anarchist says the same. But with the aid of his axiom, but with the aid of his axiom of the good man and the corrupt government, the latter draws the opposite practical conclusion, namely that all governments must be opposed for the reason that every government is a dictatorship. Every claim of decision must be evil for the anarchist, because the right emerges by itself in the immanence of life and not disturbed by such a claim. So therefore, naturalness, this idea that emergence of life from itself and not from a claim of this, right? The radical antithesis forces him, of course, to decide against the decision. And this results in the art paradox, whereby Bakunin, the greatest anarchist of the 19th century, had to become, in theory, the theologian of the anti-theological, in practice, the dictator of the anti-dictatorship. Right? That's the whole line, the joke of this, and that's how he ends that book, the chapter. Right? Buchan, it's the contradiction that because the system is the system is going to go. But to achieve this, I must create a theology of the anti-theological, become a theory of the in other words, his theory became the theory of a theologian of the anti-theological, and dictator of the anti-dictatorship. Okay, Bakunin's, because all decision is dictatorship in that way. Because there should be no decision. Decision is an arbitrary thing. In other words, right emerges by itself in immanence of life and not deterred by external claims. Right. The radical antithesis forces him to decide against decision. He's now going to decide that almost sudden In other words, in one sense, he says that I think Schmitt says that the reality of the situation forces a decision, even though they deny that decision is possible. This is the problem, right? This is the problem of, and this is why they kind of are. There is a decision engaged, but going in the opposite direction, as he says. This is where Schmitt ends the discussion. This ends his book. It's a chapter in the book, Political Theology. So if you have any comments or questions or issues you want to talk about, please put them in below, and I will respond to them when I see them. If you liked what I did here, like it, pass it to a friend, put it on social media, spread it around. If you've not subscribed, please subscribe. Please get others to subscribe. We need to grow the channel. Um, if you didn't like it, okay, you didn't like something I did here, I did something wrong, you can put the thumbs down, but then say in the comments what it is, so we can all learn from it and be corrected by it, right? Um, and here ends our thing. Now you can find me the social links if you want to follow me below on my various social media things. You can follow the links below. If you want to help me doing this, you can always do so by becoming a member or subscribe to our Patreon. Please, I can use all the help I can get. I like to get to do this more. Um, Another way you can do it again is go buy my book in Lulu. I have a book on the. I have one book so far in Lulu. It's kind of a workbook on Aristotle's politics, notebook on Aristotle's politics, which is kind of Cliff's notes, helping students do. It's not cheap, but it's a useful tool. But again, this is not about Aristotle, so I don't like shilling the book completely. But if you buy it it's available at all the major online bookstores. But if you want to help me directly to make sure I get the money the bookstores get, you buy it by Lulu directly. Okay, that's it. That's enough of this. Take care, and we come to an end of this little thing. And I might do one more, and that it will be on that famous essay about depolitization. Okay, so take care.